I almost didn't make it to the hospital in time, and if I had waited 5 more minutes to believe my own granddaughter, I don't know what I'd be telling you right now. My name is Hannah Cathcart. I'm 68 years old, and for 3 years I have been a grandmother who has to ask permission to see her own blood. That Saturday started like every other one had since my son Andre passed. Twice a month, his daughter Imani comes to spend the day with me, and I treasure every single one of those visits like they could be the last, because legally, they could be. Nobody owes me that child. Her mother allows it, and I have learned to be grateful for what's allowed. Imani was quiet that morning when Cheryl dropped her off. Quieter than usual. I made her favorite, smothered chicken, rice, candied yams, and halfway through her plate, her little head dropped forward like somebody had unplugged her. I shook her gently. "Baby, wake up for Grandma." She blinked up at me slow, confused, like she was swimming up from somewhere deep. I told myself she'd had a long week at school. I told myself a lot of things that day, and most of them were lies I needed to believe. By the time we got to dessert, she was awake again, but something in her had changed. She wasn't eating. She was watching me the way a child watches an adult when they're deciding whether to trust them with something heavy. Then she said it. "Grandma, can you please tell Roy to stop putting pills in my food? Mom won't stop him." I want you to understand something. 11-year-old children do not say sentences like that by accident. There was no confusion in her voice, no exaggeration. She said it the way you'd tell somebody the stove was hot. Plain, tired, like she'd been carrying it a long time and finally set it down in front of somebody she trusted to pick it up. I did not call her mother. God knows I should have thought it through more, but I didn't think. I moved. I grabbed my keys, grabbed her hand, and I drove faster than I have driven in 20 years straight to the emergency room. If you're watching this right now, I want to know, what time is it where you are? Tell me in the comments, because where I'm from, it was just after 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon when my whole world tilted sideways. They took her back fast once I said the word pills. Drew her blood before I could even finish filling out the paperwork. I sat in a plastic chair that didn't fit a body my age comfortably, and I prayed the way I hadn't prayed since I buried my son. Fast, scattered, half-formed prayers that were really just his name over and over. It felt like hours. It was probably 40 minutes. Then the door opened and the doctor walked back in. I have sat across from doctors before. I sat across from one the night they told me Andre wasn't coming home. I know what a doctor's face looks like when they're about to break something open in you. This wasn't that face. This was something I had never seen on a doctor in my life, and it scared me worse than grief ever did. The doctor sat down across from me instead of standing, and that's the first thing that told me this was serious. Doctors stand when news is quick. They sit when they need you to hear all of it. "Mrs. Cathcart," he said, "the preliminary screening results came back. I want to walk you through them carefully." I nodded. My hands were folded so tight in my lap, they'd gone pale at the knuckles. He explained that the hospital's initial screening wasn't the same thing as final toxicology testing. The full lab work would take longer. But what they were seeing already concerned him. There wasn't just one substance showing up in Imani's system. There were several. Indicators consistent with a sedative, an antihistamine at a level far too high to be easily explained by a routine dose, and signs of a third compound the lab was still working to identify through additional testing. He said it slow, the way you'd explain something to somebody you were afraid might break. "These are preliminary findings," he said. "The confirmatory testing will tell us more, but what we're seeing raises serious concerns. The levels, the combination of substances. This doesn't look like a child accidentally getting into a medicine cabinet." I felt the room tilt, the same way it had in the car on the way over, except this time there was nowhere to drive to fix it. How long? I asked. Has this been happening? He looked at me with something close to gentleness. That's actually what I need to ask you. I didn't have an answer. I thought of every Saturday she'd come to me a little slower than the last, a little quieter, and I had called it growing up, called it school, called it anything except what it apparently was. Months. It could have been months, sitting right under my nose, and I had passed her the dessert and asked about her grades. The confirmatory testing will take longer, he continued. But based on what we're seeing already, I have to report this. He didn't say it harshly, just plainly. Cases involving unexplained substances in a child this age aren't optional. CPS gets called. Law enforcement gets called. It happens whether you want it to or not. I told him I wanted it to. I told him I wanted somebody, anybody, to start asking the questions I didn't know how to ask. He nodded like he'd heard that exact sentence from 100 other grandmothers before me. And maybe he had. He left to make the calls. I sat there with my granddaughter's hand in mine while she slept off whatever was still working through her small body, and I tried to count backward through every visit, every nap at my kitchen table, every time I'd thought, bless her heart, she's just tired. I wasn't tired anymore. I was awake in a way I hadn't been in years. The kind of awake that comes after you realize you've been asleep at the wheel of something that mattered. The door opened again. Not the doctor this time. A woman in plain clothes with a lanyard and a folder, moving with the particular calm of somebody who has delivered hard news for a living and learned not to let her face show it first. Mrs. Cathcart, she said, I'm with the hospital's family services unit. I need to talk to you about what happens next, and I need you to understand. This isn't going to be your decision to make alone anymore. I looked at her, and for the first time since I'd carried Imani through those emergency doors, I understood that whatever I thought I was walking into tonight, it was already bigger than the both of us. The social worker's name was Ms. Predovich, and she had a way of talking that made hard news sound like a checklist. Here's what's happening tonight, she said. We're filing a temporary in-home safety plan. Roy will not have unsupervised contact with Imani while CPS investigates, but Imani is going home with her mother. I sat up straighter than my back wanted to. Home? After what that doctor just told me? I understand your concern, she said, and I could tell she'd said that exact sentence more times than she could count. But right now, we have evidence that something happened. We don't have evidence of who did it. The toxicology doesn't have a name attached to it yet. I asked her plainly what that meant for me. She told me, gently as she could, that it meant nothing. Not tonight. Grandparents don't have automatic custody rights, safety plan or not. My only path forward was through proving something, not feeling something. I called Latrell Bowers from the hospital parking lot with my hands still shaking. She let me finish before she said anything. Hannah, I'm not going to lie to you, she said. Right now, you have a scared child and a suspicious blood work report. That's not nothing, but it's not a custody case either. If this investigation stalls, and they do stall, it can close as unsubstantiated. Then you've got even less than you have tonight. So what do I do? You document everything, she said. Every visit, every word Imani says, every excuse anybody gives you. Because right now, the system is moving. It's just moving slow, and it's moving careful. And careful doesn't always catch what it's supposed to. I hung up feeling like I'd been handed a job nobody trained me for. Cheryl arrived 20 minutes later, and I watched her walk through those emergency room doors with her coat still buttoned wrong, like she'd dressed in a hurry, but not for the reason I would have hoped. She didn't ask where Imani was first. She didn't ask what the doctors found. She looked at Ms. Predovich, then at me, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Can we keep this off the record before this turns into something bigger than it needs to be?" I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. "Cheryl," I said, Careful. Your daughter had 3 substances in her blood that don't belong there. I know what they told me on the phone, she said, lower now, glancing at Ms. Predovich like she was checking who could hear her. I just don't want this turning into a whole production. People talking. CPS in our business for months. Months. She said the word like it was the inconvenience, not the child. I looked at my daughter-in-law, a woman I had hugged at my son's funeral, a woman I had once prayed would heal from losing him the way I was trying to. And for the first time, I didn't recognize what I was looking at. This already is bigger than you wanting it quiet, I told her. She didn't argue with me. She just looked past me toward the room where they were keeping Imani, and something in her face told me she was far more worried about being seen than being caught. Roy Boatwright was the kind of man who showed up with tools before anybody asked him to. I remember the first time I really saw him. Not just met him, saw him. My gutter had been hanging loose off the back of the house for 2 months, and I kept meaning to call somebody. One Saturday, he just appeared with a ladder strapped to the top of his truck, said Cheryl mentioned it, and fixed it before I'd even finished making him sweet tea. He never raised his voice, not once, in all the time I'd known him. He sat through Imani's school plays in the back row, clapped at the right moments, brought juice boxes nobody asked him to bring. If you'd told me 3 years ago that I'd one day be sitting in a hospital hallway suspicious of that man, I'd have called you cruel for saying it. That's the part that still turns my stomach when I think back on it now. He was good at the parts of being a father that don't cost anything but time. And I mistook that for the whole man. He walked into the hospital that night, still in his work clothes, like he'd come straight from a job, and his face did exactly what a worried stepfather's face is supposed to do. He asked where Imani was. He asked if she was in pain. He asked Ms. Predovich, calm as anything, what the safety plan required of him. I'll do whatever keeps her safe, he said. Supervised visits, whatever you need. I'm not going to fight any of it. Ms. Predovich seemed almost relieved by that. I watched her shoulders ease a little, the way people's do when somebody makes their job easier. I didn't feel that same ease. Something about how quickly he agreed sat wrong in me, though I couldn't have told you why that night. He turned to Cheryl and pulled her into a hug, the kind that looks tender from a distance. His hand flat against her back, her face pressed into his shoulder like he was the one steady thing left standing. I stood a few feet away and watched the whole thing happen, and it was only after, replaying it in my head on the drive home, that I noticed what hadn't happened. He never asked what they found in her blood. Not once. Not, what was it? Not, how much? Not, is it going to hurt her long term? A man who loved that child the way he performed loving her should have asked first, before anything else, the way I had asked, the way any of us would ask if we didn't already know the answer sitting cold in our own chest. I didn't say anything that night. I just watched him hold my daughter-in-law and agree to every rule put in front of him, easy as breathing. And I thought about how a man who has nothing to hide usually wants to know exactly what was found. Roy didn't want to know. He already knew. 3 weeks is long enough for a case to start dying, and nobody tells you that's what's happening until it's almost done. Ms. Predovich called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and I could hear in the first half second of her voice that this wasn't going to be the call I'd been praying for. I want to be honest with you, she said. Every supervised visit Roy's had has come back clean. No incidents. We don't have a named substance source, and without a witness statement pointing to him specifically, this file is at real risk of closing as unsubstantiated. Unsubstantiated, I repeated, because the word didn't sound like it belonged anywhere near what happened to my granddaughter. It doesn't mean we don't believe something happened, she said. It means we can't prove who did it. Those are different things in this system, and I know that's not fair to hear. I thanked her for her honesty, because she had been honest with me, and I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time without moving. I thought about what Latrell told me that first night. that the system moves slow and careful doesn't always catch what it's supposed to. I understood now that she hadn't just been preparing me. She'd been warning me. So I bought a notebook. Plain, spiral, the kind I used to buy for Andre when he started school. And I started writing down everything I could remember and everything still happening in front of me. Every Saturday, Imani had come to me tired, before any of us knew why. Every excused absence Cheryl mentioned in passing. Every small thing Imani said that I'd let slide past me, because I didn't know yet that it mattered. It wasn't enough sitting alone in a drawer, so I took it to Verna Highsmith. Verna had spent 30 years as an ER nurse before she retired, and she'd sat 2 pews behind me at church longer than either of us cared to admit out loud. If anybody could read what I couldn't, it was her. She put on her glasses at my kitchen table and went through every page slow, tracing the dates with one finger, not saying much. I watched her go still on one particular stretch, 3 Saturdays in a row, all roughly 2 weeks apart, all marked with the same word in my own handwriting. Tired. These dates, she said finally, they're not random. Look how even they are. I leaned over her shoulder and saw it the way she was seeing it. Not a child who occasionally had a bad night, but a pattern laid out plain as a calendar. Hannah, Verna said, setting the notebook down slow. What exactly does Roy do for work? I opened my mouth to answer her, and nothing came out, because I realized in that moment I had known that man for 3 years, and I could not tell you one specific thing about what he did between the hours of 8 and 5. I had never gotten a straight answer. I had simply never asked. I wasn't looking for anybody when I stopped for gas that Thursday. I was just trying to get through a day like all the others had been lately. Careful, watchful, waiting on a phone call from Luttrell that hadn't come yet. Theo Beaumont was at the pump across from mine, and I almost didn't recognize him at first. Cheryl's younger brother had always been the soft one in that family, the kind who hugged too long at funerals and borrowed money he was slow to pay back. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, and jumpier, like a man who'd had too much coffee or too little sleep. Miss Hannah, he said, and his smile didn't sit right on his face. How's Imani? She's home, I said, watching him closer than he probably noticed. How's your sister holding up? She's good. Better, actually. He said it too quick, the way people talk when they're filling silence instead of answering a question. Roy's been doing real good for them lately. His side work's been paying off. She finally got some breathing room, with the bills and everything. Side work, I said, careful to keep my voice light. What's he doing exactly? Theo shrugged. I don't know. Logistics stuff, deliveries, moving things around for people. Pays better than his regular job, that's all I know. Moving things, I repeated. What kind of things? I don't really ask, Miss Hannah. He laughed, but it came out thin. Not my business. I kept my tone easy, the way you talk to a nervous animal you don't want to spook. Theo, you know if there's anything going on with Imani, anything at all, you can tell me. I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble. I just want my granddaughter safe. Something flickered across his face, quick and uncertain. For a second, I thought he might actually say something. Instead, he looked down at the concrete between us. You ever get a feeling about somebody? He said quietly. And then tell yourself you're being unfair? I didn't answer right away. Sometimes, I said. He nodded, like that meant more to him than it should have. Then he glanced toward the road and seemed to remember himself. I gotta go, Miss Hannah. Theo! But whatever had started rising in him had already disappeared. He pulled the nozzle from his truck, put it back in place, and climbed behind the wheel. I stood there watching him. Not because he'd told me anything useful, because he hadn't. A man who knows nothing doesn't struggle that hard to say it. Theo drove away a minute later, and I finished pumping my gas, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, but all the way home, one sentence kept replaying in my head. You ever get a feeling about somebody and then tell yourself you're being unfair? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized something uncomfortable. Theo wasn't talking about Roy because he trusted him. He was talking about Roy because he didn't. Deacon Pettiford has been at my church longer than I have, and he's the kind of man who knows everybody's business without ever seeming like he's asking for it. I told him about Theo at the gas station after Sunday service, careful not to say more than I needed to, but enough that he understood I was carrying something heavier than worry. He didn't ask me to explain myself. He just nodded slow and said his nephew might be willing to look at what I'd collected, if I didn't mind hearing an officer's opinion before anything became official. His nephew's name was Marcus. Young, sharp-eyed, the kind of officer who still believed the job meant something. He came by Verna's house 2 days later, off the clock, no paperwork, just a favor for his uncle. I laid out my notebook in front of him the way I had for Verna. He went through it slower than she had, asking questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. You said Roy does logistics work, he said. You know the company name? I didn't. Nobody had ever given me one. You know where he travels? I didn't know that either. Marcus nodded. Most of what you've got here isn't evidence, he said. Not yet, but sometimes patterns matter before you know why they matter. He tapped a page in my notebook. This Saturday here, you wrote that she could barely stay awake. I nodded. He flipped forward. And here, same thing. Then again, and again. The more pages he turned, the quieter the room seemed to get. Verna leaned forward beside me. What are you seeing? Marcus pointed at the dates. They're spaced out. Lots of things are spaced out, Verna said. Not like this. He grabbed a blank sheet of paper and started writing down the dates separately. When he finished, he slid the page toward us. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I saw it. Nearly every incident happened within the same narrow window. Not exactly every 2 weeks, but close enough that it stopped feeling accidental. Verna saw it too. That's not normal, she said quietly. No, Marcus agreed. It's not. I asked him what he thought it meant. He leaned back in his chair. I don't know yet. It was probably the most honest answer anybody had given me since this whole thing started. But if somebody was giving her something intentionally, he continued, patterns like this matter. People who do things repeatedly tend to develop routines. They get comfortable, predictable. The words settled heavily in the room. Predictable, not random, not accidental. Predictable. Marcus closed the notebook and slid it back toward me. If this ever becomes an official investigation, he said, this is exactly the kind of thing detectives would want to see. Dates, notes, observations. Not because it proves anything by itself. He tapped the cover. Because sometimes it tells them where to start looking. Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Then Verna picked up the notebook and looked down at it again. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone quiet. In 30 years of emergency rooms, she said, I saw plenty of children who were accidentally overmedicated. A parent gives the wrong dose. A grandparent mixes up bottles. Things happen. She tapped the dates Marcus had written down. But accidents don't usually keep appointments. I looked at her. She set the notebook down carefully between us. I don't think this is about making her sleepy. The room went still. I think somebody is giving it to her for a reason. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something colder than fear settle into my chest. Because reasons meant intent. And intent meant somebody had decided my granddaughter was useful for something. The supervised visits were the only time I had alone with Imani now. An hour at a community center with a caseworker reading quietly in the corner, pretending not to listen while listening to everything. That Wednesday, Imani was coloring at the little table, more relaxed than I'd seen her in weeks, and I made a point not to push. I'd learned by then that pushing made her go quiet in a different way. Careful, guarded, like a door easing shut before you could see what was behind it. So I let her talk when she wanted to talk, and that day, without me asking a single question, she wanted to. "Grandma," she said, not looking up from her crayons, "can I tell you something weird?" "Always." She hesitated. I don't know if it was a dream or if it really happened. My chest tightened, but I kept my face still. "What do you remember?" "I was in a car." She pressed the crayon harder against the paper. "It was dark outside. I think I was supposed to be asleep." I waited. There was a bag in the trunk. A big one. I heard it when we went over a bump. I kept my face calm, the way Verna had taught me without ever saying so out loud. Steady, patient. A face that doesn't tell a child her words just split the room open. "Who was in the car?" "Roy was driving." She frowned at the paper. "There were 2 other men too. I didn't know them." My heartbeat felt loud enough to hear. "What happened?" "One of them kept looking back at me." She stopped coloring. "Like he was checking if I was still asleep." I said nothing. I kept my eyes almost closed so he wouldn't know I was awake. My hands wanted to shake. I didn't let them. "What did he look like?" She squinted, reaching for the memory. "He had a scar right here." She touched her eyebrow. "And a gold tooth, right in the front." "Anything else?" A deep voice. She shrugged. "That's all I remember." Then she added quietly, "I couldn't move my legs very good." The room seemed to go still around me. I told her it sounded scary and asked if she wanted to color the sky purple instead of blue, because purple skies were more interesting anyway. She brightened immediately, the way children do when an adult gives them permission to put something heavy down. The moment passed gently, like it had never happened at all. But the second the caseworker walked her back to the waiting room, I sat down outside with my notebook. I wrote everything down. Scar above the eyebrow, gold tooth, deep voice, a large bag in the trunk, a child trying to pretend she was asleep, a child who couldn't move her legs properly. I stared at those notes for a long time after I finished, not because they answered anything, because they created questions I didn't know how to ask. For weeks, I'd been trying to understand why somebody would keep giving my granddaughter substances that didn't belong in her body. Now, for the first time, I wasn't wondering if there was a reason. I was wondering where that car had been going. Imani left her coat at my house after our last visit, and I used that as my reason to drive it over, though if I'm honest with myself, I'd have found a reason regardless. Cheryl let me in without much warmth, the way she'd been letting me into everything since this started. Politely, carefully, like a woman opening a door just wide enough to hand something through without letting you see the room behind her. "I'll just leave it on the table," I said, stepping into her kitchen while she went to call Imani down. And that's when I saw it. A spiral notebook, the cheap kind from the dollar store, half tucked behind a stack of mail in an open drawer. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that. But the drawer was open, and Cheryl's handwriting is something I'd know anywhere. Small, slanted, the same hand that used to write Andre love notes folded into his lunch. Dates down one column, numbers down the other. 300, 400, one entry for $800, underlined twice. I didn't touch it. I barely had time to look at it. But I saw enough to know it wasn't a grocery list, and it wasn't household budgeting. The second Cheryl came back into the kitchen, she noticed where my eyes were. Not the notebook itself, the drawer. And before either of us said a word, she pushed it shut. Too fast, too deliberate. What struck me wasn't the movement. It was her. She looked exhausted, not tired, worn down. The kind of worn down that settles behind a person's eyes after too many sleepless nights. For a second, I thought she might say something. Instead, she looked away first. I left, without mentioning it, but the image stayed with me all night. The next morning, I told Latrell what I'd seen. Not specific dates, not account numbers, just the notebook, the money entries, and the way Cheryl reacted when she realized I'd noticed it. Luttrell listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Hannah, by itself, that's not evidence. I know. But if she's keeping records, that means she's tracking something. People don't usually write down money they're proud of. They write down money they're worried they'll have to explain later. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was enough to push the conversation in a direction neither of us had been able to ignore. I went to see Cheryl alone that evening. No caseworker, no audience, just the two of us. When she opened the door, she looked worse than she had the day before. There was a half-finished cup of coffee on the counter and dark circles under her eyes she hadn't bothered trying to hide. I saw the notebook, I told her. The reaction was immediate. Not anger, not denial. Something worse. I watched her face do something I hadn't seen it do since Andre's funeral. Crumble, all at once, like something load-bearing had finally given out. I didn't know everything, she said, voice breaking. I swear to you, Hannah, I told myself it was just extra work. Side money. After Andre died, the bills didn't stop just because he did. Nobody tells you that. Nobody tells you grief doesn't pay the mortgage. And Imani? I asked. What did you tell yourself about her? She didn't answer right away. She pressed both hands flat against the kitchen counter like she needed something solid to hold her up. I kept telling myself I was wrong, she whispered. The words seemed to surprise even her. I kept telling myself there had to be another explanation. Then she closed her eyes. If I say it out loud, Hannah, she whispered, I lose everything. I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman my son had loved, at the mother of the only piece of him I had left, and I said the truest thing I had in me. You already have. Detective Cordell Yancey had the look of a man who'd heard every version of every story at least twice, and he greeted us that way too, polite, unhurried, and already half-finished with us before we sat down. Luttrell had pulled every favor she had to get us in front of him directly instead of buried in a general report, and I could tell from the way he glanced at his watch that he considered this a courtesy he hadn't fully agreed to extend. So let me make sure I understand, he said, leaning back. You've got a grandmother's notebook, a granddaughter's dream, and a daughter-in-law's grocery budget, and you want me to open a trafficking investigation into a man with a steady job and no record. That's not quite all of it, Luttrell said evenly. It's a working man's word against a grandmother's suspicion, Yancey said, not unkindly, just tired in the way of a man who'd watched cases like this go nowhere before. I need more than a feeling, counselor. I had promised myself I wouldn't raise my voice in that office, and I didn't. I simply opened my notebook and started laying it out the way Verna and Marcus had taught me to see it. April 3rd. Imani fell asleep at my table. April 17th. Same thing. May 1st. May 15th. Every 2 weeks, almost to the day. I slid the toxicology report across his desk next. Multiple substances. The hospital reported it themselves. He picked it up and read it more carefully than he'd read anything else we'd brought. These are preliminary findings, he said. I know. But they're serious. That was the first thing he'd said all afternoon that sounded less dismissive than cautious. I slid another page toward him. The dates. He looked down. Marcus had helped me separate them onto a single sheet. Every visit where Imani arrived unusually drowsy. Every visit where something felt wrong. What's this second column? He asked. The weekends Roy was supposedly working overnight, I said. Not official records. Dates Cheryl mentioned over the years. Times he was gone. Yancey studied the page. I could see him trying not to give it more weight than it deserved. You're saying they overlap. I'm saying they overlap enough that I stopped believing it was random. He didn't answer. I slid over my notes from the supervised visit. The car. His eyes moved to the page. Imani described a man with a scar over his eyebrow and a gold tooth. And 3 weeks ago, I watched Cheryl's brother talking to a man who matched that description. Yancey looked up. For the first time, he seemed fully present. Did your granddaughter ever meet this man? No. Did she hear you describe him? No. He made a note. Not agreement. Just a note. Luttrell spoke next. We're not asking for an arrest, detective. We're asking you to look. The room went quiet. Yancey sat back and looked at everything spread across his desk. The notebook, the toxicology report, the dates, the notes from Imani's memory. None of it proved a crime by itself. That was obvious. The problem was what it looked like when it all sat together. Finally, he picked up the toxicology report again, then the date sheet, then the notes from the car ride. This still isn't evidence of trafficking, he said. No, Luttrell agreed, but it might be evidence that something bigger is worth looking at. Nobody spoke. Yancey stared at the papers for another few seconds. Then he set them down. Slowly, carefully, like a man deciding whether something belonged in a drawer or an investigation. This isn't the first time I've seen unrelated facts start lining up this way, he said finally. The dismissiveness was gone now, not replaced by certainty, by interest. He closed the folder. Leave copies with me. That wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a dismissal either. And after weeks of people telling me what couldn't be proven, it felt like the first door that had opened instead of closed. Yancey called me himself this time, which told me before he said a word that something had moved. I need you to come in, he said. Just you, not Luttrell yet. I sat across from him later that afternoon, and he had a different look about him than the tired, skeptical man from the week before. This man looked like someone who'd spent several long days reading reports he wished he hadn't found. We've been pulling records since our last meeting, he said. Financial records, business registrations, whatever we could legally get our hands on. We still don't have the whole picture, but we've learned enough to be concerned. He slid a folder across the desk. The deposits your daughter-in-law tracked led us to an account connected to one of Roy's known associates. From there, we started seeing money move through a small logistics company. Roy's company? No. Yancey shook his head. That's part of the problem. On paper, Roy isn't connected to it, at least not directly. He opened the folder. The address tied to the business is mostly a mailbox. The listed managers don't appear to spend much time there. A lot of the paperwork points somewhere else, then somewhere else again. You think it's fake? I think somebody worked hard to make ownership difficult to follow. That was different. Not certainty. Suspicion backed by paperwork. The kind detectives trust more than theories. But you followed it. We followed it far enough to become uncomfortable. That answer sat heavier than if he'd claimed certainty. Yancey leaned back. Mrs. Cathcart, I need to be careful about what I say next. We are not at the point where we can prove a larger operation. We don't have indictments. We don't have confessions. He tapped the folder. What we do have are patterns. I thought about Marcus saying the same thing weeks earlier. Patterns. Roy's unexplained trips. The money. Your granddaughter describing being in a vehicle she shouldn't have been in. Several pieces line up in ways they probably shouldn't. He paused. One possibility we're looking at is that Roy wasn't acting alone. I asked him who Roy answered to. We don't know yet. At least that answer sounded honest. We've got indications there's somebody above him, he continued, but indications aren't evidence. Right now, we've got fragments. Money moving through multiple accounts, businesses that exist mostly on paper, and people who seem careful about never putting their names anywhere important. He looked down at the folder again. There's another reason we're taking this seriously. I waited. We've prosecuted cases before where children were used as cover during transport. My stomach tightened. Cover for what? Contraband, drugs, cash, stolen property, different cases, different circumstances. He held up a hand before I could jump ahead. I'm not saying that's what happened here. I'm saying we've seen criminals use family vehicles because they attract less attention. He looked directly at me. If that's what we're dealing with, your granddaughter wasn't the target. The words landed harder than I expected. Then what was she? His jaw tightened. Possibly the reason nobody looked twice. The room went quiet. This isn't a theory built around Imani, he said. What concerns us is that several pieces of this case resemble patterns we've seen before. I sat very still. You're saying she's in danger? I'm saying we have to be exact about when we move, he said, leaning forward. If Roy gets so much as a hint we're getting close, people start making decisions. And right now, the one thing we know for certain is that your granddaughter knows more than Roy ever intended her to. I folded my hands tighter in my lap. So what do I do while you wait for exact? Yancey didn't answer right away. He just looked at me with the particular weight of a man who knew patience was about to cost me more than I'd already paid. Theo didn't call to warn anybody. That's the part I had to understand later, once all of it had already happened. He wasn't trying to start anything. He was trying to survive being questioned. Yancey's people had pulled him in quietly that Tuesday. Careful, just a conversation. Nothing official yet. But Theo panicked the way frightened men panic. He didn't go quiet. He went straight to Roy, certain that if trouble was circling his sister's house, the only way to protect himself was to make sure Roy knew it was coming. I didn't know any of that yet when my phone rang that evening. It was Yancey. His voice sounded different before he even said my name. Mrs. Cathcart, where are you right now? Something in my chest tightened immediately. At home. Stay by your phone. We may have a problem. I stood up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. What kind of problem? There was a pause. The school confirmed Imani wasn't there today. Cheryl called her in sick this morning. We also have reason to believe Roy left work hours earlier than scheduled. My stomach dropped. She's not sick. I know. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything he could have said. What happened? I asked. We don't know yet, he said. But after speaking with Theo, we're concerned Roy may believe somebody is talking. If he thinks we're getting close, he may try to move before we're ready. Move where? I asked, though some cold, clear part of me already knew. Anywhere he thinks puts distance between himself and us. I was already reaching for my keys. Mrs. Cathcart? But I had already hung up. I don't remember much about the drive to Cheryl's street. I remember the dark. I remember every red light feeling too long. I remember praying out loud without realizing I was doing it. And I remember Yancey's unmarked car already sitting 2 houses down when I arrived. Lights off. Engine running. Waiting. He stepped out before I could even open my door. Stay in your car, he said, low and fast. Please, let us do this part. I nodded, then ignored him almost immediately. The porch light was off when it should have been on. The house looked wrong. Too quiet. Too still. I got close enough to see movement at the side door. Roy? He came out carrying Imani. She hung limp against his shoulder the way sleeping children sometimes do. Except this wasn't sleep, and I knew it wasn't the second I saw her arms hanging the way they did. He opened the back door of a sedan and started easing her inside, careful, deliberate, like he was loading something fragile he couldn't afford to damage. Everything happened at once after that. The lights exploded across the yard, voices, commands, Yancey's among them, sharp, loud, certain. Roy froze with one hand still on the car door. For one long second, he looked like a man trying to decide whether to run. He never got the chance. The officers were on him before the decision finished crossing his face. I barely remember moving. One second, I was standing beside Yancey's car. The next, I was pushing past officers and reaching for my granddaughter. She was breathing. That was all I cared about. Warm, alive, breathing. I pulled her against me while paramedics rushed forward and the whole night seemed to blur around the edges. It wasn't until the ambulance lights were already flashing across the houses that I noticed something else. Something just as wrong as the dark porch. Cheryl wasn't there. Not on the porch. Not inside the house. Not anywhere among the officers moving through her front door. She was simply gone. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't expect to. I sat in a hospital chair again, the second time in this whole ordeal, watching Imani breathe steady under the lights while the sedative worked itself out of her small body. And I thought about Cheryl out there somewhere in the dark, and I didn't know yet whether to be afraid for her or of her. Yancey found me there a little after sunrise. "She walked into the station herself," he said, "about an hour ago. No lawyer waiting outside, no warning call from anybody trying to get ahead of charges. She just walked in." "Handcuffs?" I asked, because some hard, tired part of me needed to know which version of this story I was about to be handed. "No," Yancey said. "She came in carrying a bag full of records, bank statements, a ledger. She says it's everything she's been keeping hidden, every deposit, every date, more than what you saw in that drawer." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over something you're not sure you trust yet. "She's agreed to cooperate," Yancey continued. "Full statement, full testimony. Whatever it takes to build the case against Roy and whoever's above him. Her lawyer's advising her it might reduce what she's facing. But Hannah, she didn't ask about that first. She asked if Imani was okay before she asked about herself. I went to see her that afternoon, in a small room at the station that smelled like old coffee and cheap carpet. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, hands folded on the table like she was trying to hold herself together with them. "I should have stopped it the first time I suspected," she said, before I could say anything at all. "Not the first time I knew for sure. The first time I let myself wonder and decided not to look closer." "Why didn't you run?" I asked. "Last night. You had time. Because running would have meant I was still choosing the same thing I'd been choosing for months," she said, voice cracking but steady underneath it. "I chose money over asking questions for too long, Hannah. I wasn't going to choose disappearing over my daughter too. I didn't tell her it was enough. It wasn't enough, not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But I saw something in her that hadn't been there in that hospital hallway 3 weeks ago. A woman finally standing in the wreckage of her own choices, instead of asking everybody else to look away from it with her." "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she said quietly. "I know that's not mine to ask for right now, maybe not ever. I just need one thing." I waited. "I need to see her," Cheryl said, eyes wet, voice barely holding. "Before whatever happens next, the case, the charges, all of it. I just need to see my daughter's face one more time while I'm still allowed to." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, plainer too, like the kind of room nobody decorates because nobody wants to spend more time in it than they have to. Latrell had warned me it would feel anticlimactic after everything we'd lived through to get here. She was right, in a way. There was no shouting, no dramatic gavel moment like you see on television. Just a judge with reading glasses low on her nose, turning through a stack of papers thicker than anything I'd handed anybody since this began. "I've reviewed the toxicology reports," the judge said. "The emergency removal records, Detective Yancey's sworn affidavit regarding the ongoing criminal investigation and Ms. Boatwright's voluntary cooperation agreement." I sat very still, my hands folded the same way they'd been folded in that hospital chair the night this started, except now they held something steadier than fear. Latrell stood and laid it out clean, the way she'd promised she would. Every piece I'd gathered over weeks of careful, frightened work, presented now not as a grandmother's suspicion, but as a documented pattern no court could wave away. The notebook, the hospital's mandatory report, the dates that lined up with Roy's trips, Imani's own statements, the circumstances that led to her being recovered from Roy's vehicle while under the influence of a sedative. This court is not being asked to decide the criminal case today, Luttrell said. That matter remains ongoing. What we're asking the court to decide is whether Imani Cathcart can safely return to the environment from which she was removed. The judge nodded for her to continue. The evidence before this court establishes that the child was repeatedly exposed to substances that did not belong in her system, that she was placed in circumstances serious enough to trigger both a criminal investigation and emergency intervention, and that no safe parent is presently available to assume immediate custody. Luttrell paused before continuing. Mrs. Boatwright's cooperation with law enforcement should be considered encouraging. It may become relevant to future reunification efforts. But today, the court's first obligation is the child's safety. The judge looked up from her papers for the first time since we'd started and looked directly at me. Mrs. Cathcart, based on the evidence presented, the documented danger to the minor child, and the absence of a safe immediate custodial alternative, this court is granting you temporary emergency guardianship of Imani Cathcart, effective immediately. I don't remember standing up. I remember Luttrell's hand on my shoulder, steady, grounding, and I remember the particular silence of a room where something enormous has just been settled, in plain, quiet language. This guardianship will be reviewed in 90 days, the judge added. At that time, the court will evaluate any progress made by Mrs. Boatwright, the status of the criminal proceedings, and recommendations from child welfare professionals regarding future reunification. It wasn't everything. It wasn't justice finished, wrapped up clean the way you want it to be after months of fear. But it was Imani, finally, legally mine to protect, without asking anybody's permission first. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different against my face, lighter, though I couldn't have told you why exactly, given how much still lay ahead. Imani's hand was small and warm in mine, and for the first time in weeks, she wasn't watching me the way a child watches an adult deciding whether to trust them with something heavy. She was just watching the sky, like a child should. A young woman with a press badge stepped toward us before we'd even reached the car, microphone halfway raised. Mrs. Cathcart, can I ask, do you have any comment on the larger smuggling case connected to your granddaughter's situation? I stopped walking, Imani's hand still in mine, and felt every single thing I'd carried these past months rise up at once, asking to finally be said out loud. 6 months can change a child more than you'd think possible. And watching Imani run across the yard that afternoon, hair bouncing loose from its braids, I had to remind myself this was the same little girl who once couldn't keep her eyes open at my kitchen table. She's back in school now, full days, no more excused absences with no real reason behind them. Her teacher tells me she's sleeping through the night, raising her hand in class again, laughing the easy way children laugh when nothing heavy is sitting on their chest. Roy's case moved through the system the way Yancey told me these things move, slow, methodical, building outward from him to the network above him. 2 more men indicted alongside him once investigators followed the money the rest of the way up. The trial is still ahead of us, set for next spring, and I've made peace with the fact that justice in this world rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in pieces, the way mine did. A toxicology report, a notebook, a frightened brother at a gas station, a woman who finally chose to walk into a police station instead of running from it. Cheryl is still working through her own piece of it. Her cooperation bought her a path the prosecutors didn't have to give her, and she's taken every step of it seriously. Supervised visits first, twice a month, much like the ones I used to count myself lucky to get. I watch her now the way I imagine people once watched me, trying to decide how much grace a person has earned back. That afternoon, she came for her visit the way she always does now, quiet, careful, standing at the edge of my porch like she's still not sure she's allowed all the way onto it. Imani didn't hesitate this time. She ran straight across the yard and threw both arms around her mother's waist. No flinch in her body anywhere. No glance back at me first to see if it was safe. Just a child running towards someone she loved, the way children are supposed to be able to do without calculating the risk of it first. I sat on my porch that evening after Cheryl had gone, the notebook open on my lap one more time. The same spiral notebook from the dollar store, worn soft at the corners now from being opened so many times these past months. I read back through every date, every word I'd written in fear, not knowing yet what any of it would add up to. Then I picked up my pen and added one final line beneath all the others. Not a date of fear this time, but the date everything ended the way it was supposed to. The day the courtroom became real instead of a hope I was scared to hold on to too tightly. I closed the notebook and looked out at my granddaughter swinging on the same porch swing her father used to swing on, decades ago, before any of this, before I understood how much love sometimes asks of the people who carry it. I buried my son and thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong twice, once when I thought I'd lost everything, and once when I thought I couldn't get any of it back.